Did you find that ultimately took some of the pressure off?
Oh, it takes all the pressure off.
Yeah, because that sounds like
Yeah.
oh, I want to get there because that sounds like
Well,
being
yeah,
great.
you want to get there. We can get there right now.
Sure, I got time. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Might Help, Can't Hurt. Conversations with leaders, doers, and friends. And my leader, doer friend today is Genpo Roshi. And Genpo, I was trying to remember, I don't remember the year, but I'm going to share how I remember us first meeting. You may remember it completely differently. But I was very excited. I'd done Big Mind, which is the process that you developed. Was it in the 90s?
Yes.
Yeah.
99. Yeah.
99. I'd introduced it to my friend Paul McKenna, who's also been on the show. And he really wanted to meet you. And somehow a meeting was arranged. And so we flew out to, again, I'm going to get Salt Lake.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Salt Lake City. And Paul and I are both like, what's he going to be like? I mean, like, he's American, but he's a Zen master. And so we kind of like couldn't figure it out. And you're rolled up on a Harley in this tight black t-shirt. and we're like, that's what he should look like. But then it got even better. By the way, I wore in honor of you. My own tight black t-shirt. I have the body of a god. Unfortunately, it's Buddha. But, but then we went back to the temple. Was it temple, monastery?
Yes.
I'm doing okay, actually.
Yeah. Temple, center, monastery.
And there were sort of floor-to-ceiling paintings of you in the full robes.
Uh-huh.
And it was the contrast just made us both laugh because it was like, this is exactly what we should have made up. but that's us watching you. What's it like being you? I mean, how have you sat?
Insane. No, it's been insane because I've always had these two sides.
Yeah.
And they finally have come together in the last few years where they're in harmony, at peace with each other. But I've always had this kind of wild, crazy, hippie, beat kind of Zen side, even before Zen, which was 71. And then I've always had more of the traditional, straight robes. I've done kind of it all. I was, I think, the third Westerner actually, to become a Zen master in 1980. And so I've had this traditional side. And I'm finally, in the last few years, I would say maybe 4 or 5 years, kind of brought those two together. What I call the apex. If you think of a triangle and you think of the two corners, one is the wild, crazy, hippie, all that. And the other is the straight, traditional, all that. Yeah. And you put them together at the apex, and I kind of now feel like I've brought them to peace, into harmony. But it took a long time. I've been at this almost 50 years now. February will be 50 years.
Well, that was something that I remember when I don't remember which of your books I was reading, but it might have been Spitting Out the Bones, where it's sort of more story.
Yes.
Which, by the way, can you just tell the story of what Spitting Out the Bones as a phrase? Because I love the origin.
Oh, yeah. So when in 1972 or 3, I was driving with my older Dharma brother, Bernie Glassman Roshi. At that time, it was just Tetsugen, was his Dharma name. And we were picking his son up at school. And we're sitting in the car waiting for his son to come out. And I think it was first grade, whatever. And he says, our job is to swallow the whole fish. I said, what do you mean? He says, to take our teacher, which was Maizumi Roshi. Roshi just means master, Zen master. To take him and swallow him completely without discrimination. In other words, you don't pick and choose. This part I like about my teacher and this part I don't like. You don't get to do that. You have to swallow the whole fish. And then you might spend the rest of your life, which he was absolutely right, spitting out the bones.
Yeah.
And spitting out the bones meant taking what isn't appropriate for me and in this case, for the West.
Yeah.
Taking that and spitting out what's not appropriate and leaving or retaining that which is appropriate. And it's interesting. It was just around June 1st this year. My teacher died in 1995. In May 24th.
Yeah.
And On June 1st, I got a bunch of tapes sent to me by one of my Dharma successors' students, actually. And for the first time in 25 years, I was listening to my Genpo Roshi speak.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe it. I just, once again, kind of felt this overwhelming love
Yeah.
and appreciation and gratitude. And I had gone through quite a process because I really realized at that moment I had swallowed the whole fish,
Yeah.
bones and all.
Yeah.
And what I realized on June 1st of this year was I also had spit out the whole fish.
Oh, interesting.
And I didn't realize that before. I actually have completed that process of
Mhm.
spitting out the whole fish. And I started to question, did I spit out too much? Because I've gone so much back into a kind of hip Zen, away from square Zen. I think it was Alan Watts that came up with that phrase way back in 60s.
So if you were going to hip Zen versus square Zen, what would
Well,
they?
the hip Zen was kind of, how Alan Watts was. He never did traditional practice, but he actually married a woman whose father was a Zen priest, and he knew a lot about Zen. And through acid and other
Yeah.
psychedelics, he had many Zen experiences. And I was kind of the same. I had done a lot of LSD and a lot of mescaline and all that way before Zen.
Mm.
And then I got into Zen, and for the first year, I was very hip Zen. I was living in the mountains alone as a hermit,
Yeah.
and I had stopped the acid and the marijuana and all that, but I was really just sitting 4 to 6 hours a day,
Mm.
alone in the mountains as a hermit for 1 year, and then I went to the Zen Center and began studying Square Zen, traditional Zen.
Yeah.
And my teacher lived another 24 years, so I spent 24 years doing that with him.
Yeah.
And then the last 25 years since he passed, I've been integrating those two, one way to say it, or coming to the apex of that triangle of hip Zen, square Zen, and embodying these two aspects. So in my daily life, I'm very hip in a way. I don't
Clear.
know, right? Riding motorcycles, etc. But I also, at times, do the squares and the traditional. I've got, I don't know, 25 successors now,
Mm.
a bunch of people that I made Zen masters. So I also do the square Zen, the traditional Zen, particularly when there is a kind of workshop or retreat,
Yeah.
usually based in Salt Lake City these days, even though I'm living here in Boulder.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what? I mean, you said it a couple of times, and I mean, this is like the Zen for tourists conversation. But,
Okay.
but like, at what point do they go and you're a Zen master?
Well, okay, and that's arbitrary. It's
Okay.
depending on your teacher, because my teacher told me way back in 1974 or 5, and I joined him in 72, but I had a profound experience before that in 71. So he recognized that. He said, I'm going to make you a Zen master, and I'm probably going to do it by 1977, 78.
Mm.
Uh, First, you have to complete koan study, and koan study is like 700 koans, questions that you can't answer with your logical, rational mind, your
Right.
dualism. You have to transcend that. You have to go into the mind that is no mind, the
Yeah.
mind that's beyond the mind. And it's a kind of mind that is not so dualistic anymore. You see the oneness of life. You see we're all connected, which now is happening in the world. We're
Yeah.
all seeing we're connected due to the COVID
Yeah.
and other situations going on. That we're really one world, one mind, one heart, one spirit, one life, even though it looks like we all are individuals. So
Yeah.
he said that, and then I completed koan study in 79, and then he made me a teacher in 80. So one of the criteria was completion of koan study, and
Okay.
the other was that you feel as a teacher that your student has the same wisdom and compassion that as a teacher you have. In other words, can embrace with a big heart, a big mind, all sentient beings,
Mm.
and be ready to teach from that place where you're identified with all beings rather than just with the ego self.
Okay.
Okay, so that's kind of the criteria, but in not all cases is it the same. In
Right.
individuals, it
So
kind of depends.
is there necessarily, because I always found interesting your story, you had a sort of an awakening experience and then went to study.
Exactly, and that's unique.
Yeah. Okay. So I've not heard the story told that way many
Yeah,
times. That's
yeah,
wonderful.
no, that's right. That's quite unique. Most people start training. Most of my students, they train, and then after some period of time, they have an opening or a realization. We call it kensho
Yeah.
experience, where they see into their true nature. But it usually takes some years, and they work on koans and they work on other, what we call shikantaza, with just sitting still with no objective, no agenda, no goal, no aim. You just sit and get kind of reside in your beingness rather than in your other side, which is the one that's always grasping and
Yeah.
trying and working hard. But I started with that. And then I found myself going off into the mountains and living as a hermit, chopping wood and carrying water like they write about. I was 26. So when I came, I already had quite a clear understanding of Zen.
Yeah.
And in fact, he kind of pushed me on that and raised some doubt, which later, 14 years later, led to what I would call a Dai Kensho, which is a great enlightenment experience. But that
Right.
took another 14, 15 years from the day I started.
Okay. So it's not you don't have to wait for a daikensho. You don't have to
You don't have to wait, and in fact, it's a problematic if you're sitting waiting for it.
right. Um, so did you ever explore other avenues of spiritual understanding or expression? I know you did the Western, the psychotherapeutic.
Yeah, I did the psychotherapeutic. I started with a lot of Jung, Carl Jung. I did a lot of that, and I had started even before studying Jung. Back when my father died in '68,
Mm.
I started Gestalt therapy with someone who was actually working with Fritz Perls at the time,
Okay.
Harold Oaklander, and I started with him every week and working on this loss of my father. I was 24 years old when it happened. But then I started studying with actually a Freudian uh,
Mm.
analyst and so on, and kind of did that whole thing. Plus, I did EST,
Yeah.
back
Yeah.
in, I think it was 77, 78, something like that.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of things like that. And then voice dialogue in 83, 84 with Hal Stone and eventually Sidra Stone. Hal just passed away
Oh, I
this,
didn't know.
yeah, he just passed away this May.
Yeah.
That was a great loss. He was 92. And he's one of my two, I would say, shoulders that I stand on. There's Maizumi Roshi in the Zen lineage, and then Hal Stone in the psychological. He was a Jungian, and then Gestaltist, and then started voice dialogue. And I kind of stood on these two shoulders and took Hal back as my mentor in
Yeah.
2011. So for the past 9, 10 years,
Oh
he,
gosh, I
he
didn't
was
realize.
my he was my mentor, and I would go there every year, spend about a week with him, and then we had calls in the meantime.
Yeah.
A lot of talking. We became very great friends. In
Yeah.
the end, he called me a week before he died just to share some intimate stuff with me that he'd been realizing, because he continued to grow and evolve right up to the moment of his death. And still, mostly it was dream work. But he
Yeah.
actually had a dream he told me about when I visited him that August, so about 8 months earlier.
Yeah.
He told me about a dream he had where he realized that he was what we call the whole,
Mm.
the God or absolute or whatever you want to call it. For him, it was the creator.
Yeah.
And he's always been very much someone who had a lot of deep faith in God and creation and creator. And, Zen tends to be more on the other side, where there isn't it isn't a theistic religion. But I know my teacher once said, and I totally agree, if you deny God, you lose your humanity.
Hmm. It's a great
It's
expression.
a great, because I had most of my life,
Yeah.
and since 2011 have really got in touch with that side where what I would call both the non-dual and the dual.
Mm.
I don't know if your listeners or our listeners understand this, but the non-dual is the oneness, and the dual is the separation.
Mm.
Like you and I are different, we're separate and unique.
Because there's a black line between us on the camera.
Yeah. But we're really at the root or at the source, we're one.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like aspen trees. You know, I was just around a lot of aspen trees just recently. And it's interesting because they look like individual trees, as we know, but they're just one tree.
Yeah.
You know, and they appear to be different trees. Like you
So
didn't
they're
know
all
that.
connected at the root.
All connected. It's just one tree.
I had no idea.
If you have an aspen grove of hundreds and hundreds, I don't know, thousands of trees, it's just one tree. And it's kind of like that, that we're all at the root connected, but we appear to be individuals and unique. And when we appreciate our uniqueness, we also can appreciate our oneness.
Right.
And that's kind of what Zen's about. Because in Zen, we start off seeing that we're all individuals. We all start that way. And then we have the Zen experience, which is we see that we're all one and connected. You know, we're just one body, one heart, one mind, one spirit, one life. But it doesn't appear that way. So we call that the apparent reality. And then there's the real reality, or the absolute reality, which is the transcendent, which is where we see we're all connected, we're all one.
Right.
And then we have to come back in Zen and appreciate our uniqueness and have a discernment that you and I are absolutely unique. You are you and I am me, and I'll never be you and you'll never be me. And yet we're all one. We're connected. We're connected at the hip, you can say, or at the root, at the source.
And I remember being really thrown when I started doing big mind practice, where I kind of always wanted to finish there in that state, and then you or whoever else was guiding would always go, okay, and now you've got ordinary mind and you have big mind, and now what's the apex? And I'm like, wait, no, I've spent my whole life trying to get to big mind. What are you doing?
Yeah, but you know, there's a little reason behind my madness in doing that. Yeah. So one of the big problems historically in spiritual practice is most traditions only take us to the ascent of the mountain, to the peak or the summit of the mountain. And it's just half the journey. Right. The hard journey, that seems hard, okay, to get there. Like you said, I've worked my whole life to get there. And then I say, okay, now we have to descend. Right. Because it's in the descension that actually we start to embody the love and the compassion in a relational way, in a personal way with others, like we had before, but it's much deeper now because we see the connection.
Right.
So we go to the top, and at the top, there's only room for one. It's like K2. There's only room for one person at a time up there.
Yeah.
And so when you get there, you're alone. You're completely alone. And you see that anybody who's ever gotten there has had the same experience of I alone am. That there are no others. At that point at K2, you're alone on this mountain. But then you do have to descend. It's just a matter of time. And you've got to come down or you'll freeze to death or die up there, right? You've got to come down. So most traditions don't emphasize the coming down. And when that happens, when we start to come down, we feel like we're losing our enlightenment. Right. But the point is, we have to let go of our enlightenment. So it is a kind of loss. And we do go through a kind of grief process. And it's not just one time we do this. Yeah. Now, for me, it's been actually twice, 94 and 2011, that the first time I thought I was at ground zero or ground level, sea level, only to find out I was still 5,000 feet up. And I had another big descent coming. Right. And that was 2011. So whatever amount of years that is. It's a lot of time. 16 years or something.
That speaks to what, when you and I chatted briefly before, and you said, "What do you want to talk about?" And I was like, "Actually, I do want to talk about something," which isn't always the case on this show.
Yeah.
But so you've got, and forgive me because my Zen is almost like comic book Zen. Like it's like I.
So's mine. So don't worry about
it. But you've got this tradition, which seems to me to be about transcending the world.
Yes.
And then you have this world.
Yes.
And right now in this world, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of chaos in the environment. Right. There's a lot of chaos amongst the people. And just forget the detail. Like there's a lot of chaos.
Tremendous.
And so what can we learn from, and forgive me if I'm phrasing this wrong, but like what can we learn from Zen that might help us in the world of chaos that is where the separate self seems to be residing right now?
Right. I think it's an excellent question, and it's something I've spent a lot of time looking at.
Yeah.
And frankly, I feel as a globe, as a planet, we're kind of going through a very similar process that as an individual, some of us have been going through most of our life, and people have gone through it for thousands of years, which, if we say it globally, we're beginning to really see what's considered the first opening, the first awakening, which is that we are all connected, that we are all interdependent on one another and interrelated. So we're not an island. We're not individuals. And it's so much easier to see right now than, let's say, it was 50 years ago or 20 years ago or even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That we see that one man, one person, let's say Washington, D.C., for lack of a better, we could say Florida or someplace else, one person can affect the whole world.
Yeah.
And we're beginning to see what we've known for at least 2,500 years, that, let's say, a butterfly flaps its wings in South America and it snows in Siberia.
Yeah.
We're beginning to really see how connected we are. And that's kind of the first realization. And how impermanent everything is.
Yeah.
Like even our climate is changing. The whole world is changing. I don't know if you've noticed it, but time has changed.
In what way? I'm curious.
Well, I mean, it's a personal thing, but don't you feel like you're living Groundhog Day every day? Right? And that what happened yesterday seems like a week ago. And what was 6 months ago seems like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, can you even remember the other reality?
Yeah.
I mean, right? So we're in a new reality.
Yeah.
And there's no going back. We may be able to, we're going to adjust to the new reality, but there's no real going back. That's all Zen. All of Zen is about change and impermanence, and that we're all mortal and yet we're unborn and undying. Those two sides.
Yeah.
So the transcendent allows me to realize that I am unborn and undying, and yet I am mortal. I have a lifespan. I will die. What happens after that, I don't know. But we know that these two sides of reality, the real and the absolute, are one, like the yin and yang symbol.
Yeah.
You got the yin, you got the yang, the absolute and the relative. And so what it is that we're learning right now is what we learn in Zen, is that everything is transitory. There's constant change. The only thing that doesn't change is change itself. The only thing that's not permanent is impermanence. So, or the only thing that's permanent is impermanence. And so that's the first thing. So as a planet, we're about, I don't think we're there yet, but we're about, maybe in the next 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, 100 years, to realize what we call the first awakening, but it'll be on a global level, where we all wake up to the fact that we are one. And we're getting there. We realize it now more intellectually, but soon it will be every child, every person knows that we're all connected, and what you do affects me and what I do affects you. The second awakening is a kind of practice where we get more looking into ourselves, more self-reflective, where we may begin meditation or Tai Chi or walking on the beach or walking in the mountains, where we're contemplating life and we're going deeper and deeper into something beyond just the mundane and the materialistic. And we begin to see how greedy I am, how unloving I am and manifest, how uncompassionate I might be, and how angry I can get and hateful. We're beginning to self-reflect more and more as a planet. And there are theories that there's a tipping point, maybe 7% of the planet makes this awakening and the whole planet awakens. That happens to be Ken Wilber's
That's how I would remember that.
Yeah. I don't know what that number is, but at some point we will flip.
Yeah.
I don't know when that will be, but it will happen, and we'll all wake up to the oneness. And I think right now we're in that period before the awakening as an individual and as a planet. As an individual, you know how it gets pretty tight. We get pretty confused, and we don't know why we're here, and we start to question, what am I doing here on this in this planet? What's my role? What's my not my agenda, but my purpose, my whole thing, and we suffer, and we wake up to something greater. So that's where we are, I believe, as a planet, and where we are as individuals. But there are 5 stages, and we're not even at the first stage globally that we go through on a personal level.
All right.
Because the second one is
attractions.
okay. So the second one is devotion.
Okay.
It's devotion to something greater than oneself. The small self, the ego self, which is also one mind. It's all contained here. It's not out there where there's no inside outside. Let's put it that way. It's all one. So we devote ourselves, and we have practices that help us. In Buddhism, they're different than Christianity, but basically prayer or meditation or chanting or bowing or other ways that we show devotion. And then the third stage is what we call Daikensho, the Great Awakening. That's where we ascend to the summit of the mountain. And that's what we were talking about earlier.
Sure.
At that level, we see that there's only I.
Yeah.
And this I, this me, is the whole. Okay? But then there's the fourth, and that's the first descent off the mountain.
Right.
And that first descent, we don't come all the way down, but we do come down into a more relative reality. And I remember having this little dispute with my teacher just before he died. It was just before he died, the last time I saw him, and we had this argument. And he was saying to me, your talk, which I gave a talk to a bunch of masters, Zen masters, and American and Japanese. And he said, your talk, I felt, was too personal. And I had just descended the mountain in 94 the first time. And I said, it's all personal, Roshi. It's all personal. It's all personal. And okay, yeah, you're right. But it was too personal. Anyway, I talked a lot about myself and about my family and all that. And that's not so Zen to talk so much about yourself. So in that level, we begin to come back to the personal, because the transcendent is very impersonal.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so free and why it's so liberating, because no one else exists. Now, psychologists have a problem with this. I remember Hal Stone telling me, you were so lucky that you didn't end up in a mental institution. I don't feel I was so lucky. I feel like the tradition held me. But anyways, he said that. And then there's a second descent, which is the fifth level, where you come down to actually sea level. And that's another descent, and it's a hard fall, because what happens is you drop all the enlightenment, all the identification of being anything in particular, and you become just an ordinary human being. Now, name me how many people you know that are just really, truly natural and ordinary, just themselves, and you probably can't.
Yeah.
You know, it's really, really. So at that place, if I use my kind of theory of the triangle,
Yeah.
in Zen, our, let's say, aspiration is to have what we call ordinary mind, or to be completely ordinary, and yet not, and yet extraordinary. And at the apex, one embodies the ordinary and the extraordinary.
Yeah.
And we're not making a big deal about one over the other. Like, it's so extraordinary to be extraordinary. You know, it's so great to be great. You know, or my teacher's the greatest, or my guru, or my lama, or my, you know, Rinpoche. That one is the greatest in the world, and, you know, I make bows. That's fine. You have to believe that. You wouldn't study with someone you didn't feel was the greatest.
Yeah.
But you also can appreciate their ordinariness.
Yeah.
That this is just an ordinary person. It's kind of like when we started off the talk, you know, the hip Zen and the square Zen. You know, you embody these two. We call that the hazy moon of enlightenment. And the hazy moon means sometimes you can see the moon and sometimes you can't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the clouds are covering, it's hazy, you can't quite see it, and other times it comes in. Sometimes you see the person's greatness, and sometimes you see just how ordinary they are.
Yeah.
Even so ordinary that you may think, wow, this person is really stupid.
Did you find that ultimately took some of the pressure off?
Oh, it takes all the pressure off.
Yeah. Because that sounds like
Yeah.
oh, I want to get there because that sounds like
Well,
being
yeah,
great.
you want to get there. We can get there right now.
Sure. Yeah, I got time.
I'll tell you. So the person who was with me when I had my first opening happened to be a Jungian, and he's a Jungian psychotherapist. And he was with me. He told me, "You sound very Zen," and I started to look up what Zen was. You know, he happened to be with me in the desert when I had that first opening, and I was on the beach with him about 4 years ago. Again, and I just got married this last June, and he was best man at this wedding. He was best man at my first wedding. So we were sitting on the beach and talking, and I said, "Hey, Kurt," I said, "You know, you could have everything you want and be as enlightened as you want if you would just do one thing." And he said, "Well, what is it?" I said, "You know," and he's got a PhD, and he's a professor, he's a Jungian analyst. He was the head of Jungian Institute in LA for many years, following Housestone. I said, "Well, just admit that you're completely ignorant, deluded, and stupid. Just admit you're completely deluded and completely stupid." No, I'm not going to do that. I said, "No, just own it. You'll be free." "No, I'm not going to do it." I said, "Well, what's it going to take?" He said, "Well, I'm not doing it. I've worked my whole life to be somebody. And so if you can own that I am completely ignorant, completely deluded, completely stupid, a complete fool,
Yeah.
you're there. It just relaxes you completely."
Well, in which case, in my wife's eyes, I'm already there.
Yeah, in your wife's eyes, but how about your eyes? See, because
Trust me, it's not as long a journey as you might think.
no, I don't think it is. Well, you've been doing this a long time, and of course, yeah, it's easier the longer you've been doing it. Kurt's just really beginning Zen practice the last few years, so he's not there yet. But I asked him at the wedding, I said, "Oh, so are you ready?" No.
So I'll swing us back around because
Sure.
I'm loving everywhere we're going, but you know, my kids. So you told me just before we came on, and congratulations again. You have a new grandkid. You're a grandpa. But so my kids, you know, are 18 to 22, or 18 actually to 25. I forget. Oliver keeps getting older each year. But you know, very actively engaged in social justice movements around
Yes.
here right now.
Yes. Which is great.
So where does that sit with kind of waking up to it? Like, it seems to me.
Well, it's everything.
Okay, good.
It's everything, right? Because kids nowadays, or let's say young people nowadays, I don't know what generation that's called, Y generation, whatever. But young people are already aware of the interconnectedness and the impermanence. And that's why some get into such depression with there's no future. Because if you really look at the situation, it's pretty bad, if you want to use those terms.
Sure.
It's pretty dramatic. I mean, the way climate is changing, what you've been going through in California, Northern California, what we've been going through in Oregon. I was there. I just missed all the fires. I was driving through the smoke coming home back here. All of that, I mean, it's just getting hotter and hotter and hotter. I think you had 120 some degrees in
21.
LA. 1 degrees, yeah. I remember when it was 117, 116 in LA, but never 120.
Yeah.
Even when I say 117, I thought, do I really remember correctly? But it was 1976.
Wow.
It was 117, 118 degrees in LA. Now it's 121. So climate obviously is changing, and everything. You know, we're aware of what's going on with the planet. And so to realize the first awakening, the interconnectedness, the young people they're already there. Now, maybe it's thankful to us, older, maybe, or maybe it's to technology, whatever reason, they're already way ahead of where we were at their age.
Yeah.
And so, of course, action is important, but I think simultaneously introspection is also important. Like Krishnamurti, I remember, I got to hear him live in 72 or 3, a couple of times in Ojai. And he always said the first revolution is with oneself.
Right.
You have to look in. And once you have awakened, then you can do more and be much more efficient in the work you do globally. And I do believe that. I believe that they have to come together, that we have to do the internal work, the work on oneself, and the external, and get out there into more of an active role, especially around the political and the environmental. Where we're going now, it's insane. It's just total, like you said, it's total chaos.
Yeah.
We have 3 pandemics going on right now. The COVID pandemic, the Black Lives Matter pandemic, and then the whole environmental pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way I see it.
Yeah. No. I mean, I have not thought of it in those terms, but I understand that.
Yeah.
They are analogous. There are.
Yeah.
So it's almost. What's interesting is and again, it feels so simplistic in my own head, but
that's okay.
Like, oh wait, so you can actually be in the game of life and the game of awakening to life simultaneously.
Absolutely, and that's ideal. That's ideal. So remember the triangle, the game of life and the transcendent.
Yeah.
And you have to embody both. So, I started this, I don't think I finished it. In Zen, we've always tried to rush people through being at the top, at the summit. So, like a great master Joshu, one of my favorite, he lived to 120. And sometime between 100 and 120, some monk comes to him and says, I have just arrived in your monastery this morning. What can you teach me? And he says, well, have you eaten your midday meal yet? And the young monk said, yes, I have. He said, well, then go wash your bowls. Now, it's a beautiful koan, because what he's saying, have you reached enlightenment yet? Have you reached the summit yet? And the young man says, yes, I have. He says, okay, now go wash it off.
Right.
The stink of Zen. Wash that stink off and come back down and descend the mountain. So at the descending part, we do much more on a global level to help the planet, help all beings to do that. When we're at the summit, we can't, our arms are not long enough to reach down and help the people down below. So in Zen, we say we have to descend the mountain and actually push them up from their bottom,
Yeah.
because we're all climbing that mountain.
Yeah.
We all have to descend that mountain again. The trip, the journey, I like to say trip because it's a round trip. It's not a journey where you end up someplace else. It's a trip. You go up and you come back down.
Yeah.
But what you've learned and experienced on both the ascent and the descent is what you can offer others, your own experience. So it's not theoretical, it's not conceptual, it's not out of books. I don't think I've, talked out of any book. It's just your real life experience that you're sharing.
So, last question, and I'm not in a position to ordain Zen masters, but I can ordain you emperor of the world for a minute. So this, I like to do this on this show. So, you're emperor of the world. What would you decree? What would you?
That's a good one. No, that's a really good one. We do have to wake up, right? And everybody's got to do their share of then manifesting that awakening for the world.
Mm-hmm.
But some of us are going to be ahead and some are going to be behind.
Yeah.
And whatever we can do to support those that are left behind, to help in whatever way, and it's not by preaching or teaching, it might be by getting down and dirty, into the grit of it all, but we have to do what we can because we are one. And we have a saying in the Zen tradition and Buddhist tradition too, that it's what's called the buffalo's passes through the lattice window, and yet its head, horns, and four legs can pass through, but its tail can't go through. That tail is connected to all beings, and we can't all go through until we all go through.
Right.
In other words, we all have to do this. It's a global practice. It's a global thing. We don't have to preach it because it can come in any form. It doesn't have to be Buddhist. What I love about Zen is it's not Buddhism particularly. It's actually a rebellion against Buddhism, but still with the essence of Buddhist understanding. But it's being free to be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu and still do the work, still the introspection and the awakening that it takes.
Yeah.
And helping those awaken.
Genpo, it's been too long, my friend.
Yeah.
Lovely to
Thanks,
speak.
Michael. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And all the listeners, thank you.
Beautiful.